What kind of a podcast episode begins with talking about catching bugs and snakes and amphibians and ends with talking about Kant's transcendental idealism and BDSM, gay sex? The answer is the one you're listening to, because I'm going to have Darryl Sterk on to talk about a book he translated called Homesickness by Chih-Ying. Now, did Chih-Ying set out to write about any of those topics I mentioned? Perhaps not. So it'll be up for you, the listener, to find out how this all ties together. What are those two breads that I described, and what's the literary sandwich, the sandwich filling, I should say, in the middle? Before I can sort of introduce you to Darryl, we're going to do the news first. The terrific news. I'll say before I launch right into the news, you probably noticed it's been a long time since I did an episode. That's because I started a new job and I moved house, so I'm not recording in Dundee anymore. This time I'm in England. I'm in Cheshire. I'm going to be working just outside of Greater Manchester. So the location changes nothing. The job, it's a more full-on job than the one I had before, so that might mean slower episode output because it'll be less free time, basically, but I guess we'll just see. So yeah, that's all the news. Other than that, that's all the personal news, I should say. Other personal news is it's really hot today, so I'll try not to linger on this news section too much, just in case my throat completely dries up and you have to listen to absolutely horrific dry mouth. So, the terrific news. The first item, this is a book, an academic book that came out that really caught my eye. It's called Healing with Poisons. I shall read you the blurb for this book now. I should also say this book, it's available online as an e-text. The whole thing is browsable on your web browser, and it's a really nice interface, so worth checking out if you've got a bit of time to read something on your phone or your laptop. So here's the blurb. At first glance, medicine and poison might seem to be opposites, but in China's formative era of pharmacy, which is 200 to 800 CE, poisons were strategically deployed as healing agents to cure everything from chills to pains to epidemics. Healing with Poisons explores the ways physicians, religious devotees, court officials, and lay people used powerful substances to both treat intractable illnesses and enhance life. It illustrates how the Chinese concept of a word carrying a core meaning of potency, led practitioners to devise a variety of techniques to transform dangerous poisons into this word is split by a hyphen across the line. Efficacious? Like effective, basically. Efficacious medicines. Recounting scandals and controversies involving poisons from the era of division to the early Tang period, Yan Liu considers how the concept of du was central to the ways people of medieval China perceived both their bodies and the body politic. Liu also examines a wide range of du-possessing minerals, plants, and animals in classical Chinese pharmacy, including the highly poisonous herb aconite and the popular arsenic drug 5-stone powder. By recovering alternative modes of understanding wellness and the body's interaction with potent medicines, this study cautions against arbitrary classifications and exemplifies the importance of paying attention to the technical, political, and cultural connotations in which substances become truly meaningful. There you go. So, that sounds pretty cool, doesn't it? I certainly think it does. Here is the next piece of news. Now, this is it's drugs again, actually. This is a long-form article written by friend of the show, Dylan Levi King, who's guested on 2 episodes now, and it is entitled Ketamine and the Return of the Party State, and it's up on Palladium Magazine, sorry, you can read the whole thing as a webpage. I know Dylan had, he'd been sort of gathering bits and bobs about this topic on his blog before, but basically it's a sort of a history set in parallel with the political history of, 1, ketamine in the PRC, and 2, the Chinese Communist Party from like reform and opening through to the present day, so 80s up to Xi Jinping's removal of his own term limits, and how the two are more connected than you might think. I won't say more than that, other than it's a great read. It is pretty long though, so don't sit down and think you can read it in 5 minutes, because it's a longer form article. Okay. Last piece of news. This is from the world of academic publishing. I'm just going to check actually if any of this stuff is open access or if you need academic access to read it. That's pretty important. No, I think this is only available through university institutions, but perhaps you have means to access these things depending on who you are as a reader. So anyway, I'll say what this actually is. It's not a Q&A, it's an A&Q answers and questions on Chinese Sino-futurisms, so sort of sci-fi visions of a Chinese future, basically. This is in the journal called Verge, Studies in Global Asias, the very popular academic use of a plural there, not just a single Asia, but Asias, and hence why this is Sino-futurisms, and the little s in the end is in brackets, just to make you extra clear that this is sort of academic wordplay. Now, these have been put together by two people I follow on Twitter, one of whom I'm sure is a show listener, the other one I'm not so sure. So that the former there is Virginia L. Kahn, who studies these things, basically, and the other is someone who's literally, I only know their Twitter name, Hudze, who is in like lake, I think, and then Z as in like child, and then G as in big brother, Hudze. So there's 5 of these ANQs. One is called Sino-futurisms, one is called 3 Theses on the Sino-futurist City, one is called Sino-futurism and its uses, contemporary art and diasporic desire, and the last one is my favorite title, Sino-no-futurism. So not much else to say other than the rest of the essays and sort of opening matter in the book are about Asia in general, so they're not China specific, although some of it is, but it's just this one section of the one issue of the journal, which is on this sort of Chinese sci-fi topic. So that is our Church of Fake News. So I'll stop yapping on, I'll let my dry throat recover, and you can listen to my interview with Darryl Sterk. Hope you enjoy it. Okay, so on the show we have Darryl Sterk. Hi Darryl, how's it going and what have you been up to?
Hi Angus, thanks for having me on the show. It's going okay. I've been pretty tired lately. I'm 48 now, and 48 is not the same as 46. So find in the past couple of years, I've really slowed down. I've been doing a lot of nature photography. I've gotten into herping, looking at snakes and frogs and reptiles. At night, I'm taking my daughter herping. And I'm hoping to learn more about nature because it relates to my academic research. I'm a professor at university here in Hong Kong, and I have to do research on translation. So I'm hoping to research ethnobiology, the study of biological knowledge, traditional biological knowledge of this people in Taiwan called Saidic. So the Saidic have traditional knowledge about nature. I'm trying to learn about it because often they're translating it from their own language into Mandarin. And then they also draw on texts in Mandarin, translating those into Saidic. So that's my research. It's the summertime, right? So we're not teaching, we're supposed to be doing research. I'm doing some research. I'm also revising a translation of a novel called The Mermaid's Tale, which I think is a great title in English. It works better in English than it does in Chinese because of the pun on tail. It's a story about a mermaid, right? It's spelled actually T-A-L-E, so it's the story about a mermaid, but it's also in part about her tail. the mermaid's tail in the novel is a symbol. So I'm mostly keeping myself busy.
Excellent. Perhaps this sounds ridiculous, but I feel a little bit the same about being 28 versus 26, what you said about being 48 versus 46. Maybe it's something about the number 8. It just rounds up that little bit more easily to 10 than 6 does.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully it's like just a bad number, and 29 will be better than 28, and 49 will be better than 48. But I think I'm on the downhill here, so you haven't quite started yet, I don't think.
Yeah, I'll get there. So you mentioned quite a lot there about being a translator, and you mentioned an interest in nature. So it probably is worth me pointing out that I believe you've translated one of the other books I've covered on this Taiwan season by Wu Mingyi. We covered his The Man with the Compound Eyes. That's one of your English translations, right?
Yeah, I translated qīnyuán, The Man with the Compound Eyes, and that actually had a huge impact on me personally. I took a trip to the East Coast. It's set on the East Coast of Taiwan, and I tried to find all the places that are in the novel, like all the scenes in the novel are inspired by places in East Coast Taiwan. And I started looking at the plants there. I started trying to identify the trees, and there's lots of beetles in the novel, right?
Yeah.
common and rare beetles in Taiwan, coastal creatures and creatures that live up in the mountains. So I started trying to identify everything I was looking at. And here I am, I don't know, 8 years later, and I'm still at it. So translating that novel was not just, it didn't just get my career as a translator started. It really kind of changed the direction of my life, putting it a little bit overly dramatically, but it had a huge impact on me.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I've mentioned this on the show before, talking with other guests, that I think there's something very special about literature or fiction, which is sort of tagged to real places on the world that you can go and visit, do a sort of a literary pilgrimage to. I think that's it's something I've done a few times, including a bit self-indulgently. I visited a place I'd used in one of my own short stories, and then I went to the place and I found something I didn't expect to find. You can find all sorts of...
Was this after you'd finished the story?
Yeah, this was after I'd finished it, yes.
Did you go back and revise?
I might have, yeah. So without trying to sound too grim, in the story, it's a young guy. He's walking along a bridge because he's thinking about ending it all, and something causes him not to. And I crossed. It's a road bridge. I crossed it myself on foot and found just about halfway across the road bridge there was a breakdown telephone with SOS written on it. And I was like, oh, that's very potent. So I think
that's fantastic.
Yeah, went back into the story and I think I added the phone.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Anyway, getting back on track, my next question was going to be, tell the listeners a bit about yourself. I think you've done that, but can you tell us a little bit about your journey as a translator?
Okay, sure. I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, Western Canada, but we're east of the Rocky Mountains, like about 4 hours east of the Rocky Mountains. So it's not like I could see the Rocky Mountains when I was growing up, but we often drove there to go skiing, cross-country skiing or downhill skiing. And I did a degree in English literature. I think we might have a similar academic background. Was your degree also in English?
Yeah, English.
Your BA?
Yep.
And English then you went on to do a master's in publishing?
Bingo, yep.
Right. Well, I didn't go on to do anything immediately. I went to Taiwan in 1995 with my best friend at the time, Alex Beecroft. And at the time I was homesick for Canada. And after the year was out, we immediately went back home. And I found that being home wasn't the same as it had been when I was growing up there, and started to feel a little bit homesick for Taiwan. I'd already met a woman by that time that I'm now married to and I've had a kid with. So the next year I went back to Taiwan. That was, I guess, 1996. And after another year in Taiwan, I got extremely sick. I got bronchitis for 6 months. And so I went back to Canada to try to recover and to try to find myself. And I was going to be a naturopathic doctor. I was going to do all sorts of different things. And eventually I took a course in classical Chinese. Have you done any classical Chinese in your undergrad or?
No. My experience with China, I'll do this quickly because the listeners know it. I went there just to be a TEFL teacher right after my undergrad. And if you include about 6 months being back home between that and returning to China, that was sort of 4 years between that and my master's. But my Mandarin never got that far past taxi and restaurant Chinese. I mean, maybe it did a little bit, but yeah, I never mastered it to the point where I was ready to go chasing after classical Chinese. But I have learned, just through this podcast, I've learned a reasonable amount about what classical Chinese is.
Well, I'd encountered a little bit in poetry, and sometimes street signs are in classical Chinese. There's classical Chinese everywhere. And I met a professor at the University of Victoria, Daniel Bryant, who was willing to do a one-on-one reading course with me. And so we just read classical Chinese for a year. And he seemed to think I had more talent for that than I would for naturopathic medicine. And so I abandoned that plan and went to Toronto to do a master's degree in Chinese poetry. And then I kept on going back and forth to Taiwan to see the woman I'm now married to. And master's in Chinese poetry. I finished this master's and I said, God, I can't imagine doing doing a PhD in sinology, stuff that happened 1,200 years ago. It seemed so far away. And since I'd lived in Taiwan, it was part of my personal experience. I felt like I could relate to it more. So I thought I would do Taiwanese literature for my PhD, which I eventually did. And meanwhile, I'd started working as a translator. I got my first job after teaching English for a couple of years as translator of study documents. There are these organizations in Taiwan that sell opportunities to young people to go abroad for further study. Often it's just to go and try to improve their English. They go to Spain or places in Western Europe or England, Australia, North America. So they would come in and we would translate their study documents, reference letters, which they had written themselves, and their study plans in a kind of sweatshop. I don't know if we had air conditioning or not. If we did have air conditioning, it didn't seem to work. And so we worked in these conditions, and I did that for about a year. And through that, I started working as a freelancer. And because I was an English native speaker, they just assumed that I knew stuff about the kinds of documents that they needed translating. So they basically gave me anything, regardless of whether I could understand it or not. I did some military translation, legal translation, pharmaceutical translation, technical translation. Taiwan is really important in the semiconductor industry. So I did all sorts of semiconductor related documents. And if I didn't understand it when I started translating it, I had to figure it out in a hurry. So I did that for a couple of years, and all through my PhD. And I also started a master's degree in translation in Taiwan at NTNU, National Taiwan Normal University, 师范大学翻译所. And I never finished. 没有毕业. So I think that's called 医学, like when you take a degree and can't be bothered to finish it, or can't find the time or energy to do a thesis. So I abandoned my degree at NTNU, but I met a professor there who teaches conference interpreting. She's still teaching conference interpreting, Michelle Wu, who introduced me to the Taipei Chinese Pen.
Oh, yep.
They're a great organization. They started off doing mainly blue stuff in Taiwan's political color coding, but nowadays they do basically anything. They do all sorts of different writers, and they've been really good to me over the years. And I think both Michelle, my conference interpreting teacher, and the Taipei Chinese Pen introduced me to Gray Tan.
Oh yes, I've heard of him.
Tan Guanglei, Wu Mingyi's literary agent, and a lot of people's literary agent. He at the time he was trying to get a sample done for qīnyuán to try to take it to trade publishers. And so I think he asked Michelle if she was willing to do it. And Michelle said that she was too busy, and why not try Darryl Sterk, who was interested in Indigenous people, because I'd done my PhD dissertation on the representation of Taiwan's Indigenous people in film and fiction. So there's a lot of Indigenous people and Indigenous content in the novel. Michelle thought I might be a good fit. And then the Taipei Chinese Pen arranged some sort of, not a conference, but maybe some sort of workshop. And they had asked Gray to talk at this workshop, and they asked me to be his discussant. So Gray gave a wonderful 15-minute speech, and then I tried to say something critical about the speech. And so I got the opportunity through the Taipei Chinese Pen to meet Gray. And the rest is kind of history. We did the sample for qīnyuán, which is 2 chapters of the novel, chapters 2 and 3. And very quickly, it attracted interest from book scouts and different publishers. Next thing I know, it sold to Harville Secker, and a year later I was on a world book tour to promote the novel. And since 2011, when I was working on the sample for qīnyuán, I think I've done 10 or 12 book-length works. So I guess about 1 a year, 1 or 2 book-length translations a year.
That's great. I'm going to sidetrack us slightly. You mentioned doing work that was in Taiwan's political color coding blue. Now, my knowledge of Taiwan is okay. It's all sort of secondhand. So I think I know what you mean there. But for the listeners, could you explain that? And For me, could you explain how that maps onto Taiwanese literature? Because that sounds quite interesting.
Okay, well, Taiwan's color coding is pretty easy to understand. How that maps onto literature is a little bit more difficult. I'll have to think of some good examples. I think I can think of some good examples of green and blue writers. Well, blue, since at least the late 1980s, has meant the Kuomintang, the KMT,
Yeah.
and other parties that have allied with the KMT. It wasn't until 1986, I think, late in 1986, that the KMT lifted the ban on political party formation, and the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, immediately formed. They had been organizing for at least half a decade, maybe longer, as something called the Dangwai, outside the party, Dangwai, literally outside the party. And for some reason, they got associated with the color green, and the color coding is stuck. It still means basically the same thing today as it did rather in the late 1980s. So green is DPP and blue is KMT. And in terms of the goals of the party or the party platform, the KMT still thinks that at some point in time, reunification is going to be possible. And the DPP hopes that at some point in time, Taiwan independence will be possible. And if you're close to the center, like if you're light blue or light green, you're just going to make do with the status quo. And most sane people for the past, I guess, 2 or 3 decades, for as long as I've been in Taiwan, sane people have been committed to the status quo. But there's deep blue and deep green. So deep blue people would favor more immediate reunification, and deep green would like to declare Taiwan independence. As for how that maps onto Taiwan literature, it depends on the background of the writer. And if you were a mainlander, like if your parents were from mainland China, or especially your dad was from mainland China, or you had been born in mainland China, you at least early on, you were very likely to be blue, to identify yourself as Chinese, and to hope for Chinese unification. And if you were native Taiwanese, if your ancestors had been in Taiwan for decades, if not hundreds of years, then you were probably green, and probably resented the mainlanders for monopolizing political power in post-war Taiwan. But since the 1980s, with intermarriage, it's getting harder and harder to predict what a person's political affiliations are going to be based on ancestry. You've got kids, second and third generation mainlanders who are green, and I don't think there are many native Taiwanese people that are blue, but maybe there are some out there. Can you think of any writers that are examples of blue or green writers?
Well, off the top of my head, yes, drawing on literally just this Taiwan season and books I've read for it. The last episode I did was on Taipei People by, Pai Xianyong or Bai Xianyong.
Bai Xianyong, yeah, he would be a blue writer.
Yeah.
I don't think he's a deep blue. I don't think he has any crazy political ideas or fantasies about immediate reunification. That's a good example. An example of a green writer would be somebody like Song Zelai. In the 1980s, he was he wrote a lot of pretty popular, successful works of fiction. Then he was writing novels in Taiwanese, which there's no market for, like in the Taiwanese language. And I can't remember whether he wrote them in Chinese characters or in romanization, but
right.
And he was also a leftist, so not extreme, but he was someone with strong political beliefs, and very much a Taiwanese writer. Song Zelai from the 1980s. Wu Mingyi, I think, would also be a green writer, but maybe Wu Mingyi would resent being pigeonholed or being color coded in that way.
Yes. Yeah, Wu Mingyi, if you're listening and you're shaking with rage, please do get in touch on the podcast social media.
Yeah.
You can share your opinion to the listeners. Um,
Yeah.
I'm gonna keep the ball rolling here because we've still not actually mentioned which book we're covering on this episode and which author. So you did leave some clues earlier on. You talked about homesickness, and that is the title of our book, although it is Home Space Sickness, and the author is Chih-Ying. So first question, how did you first come across him and his work?
That was also because of Fuyanren. I mentioned the world tour to promote this novel. It was just a North American tour, but we went halfway around the world, and we went twice, actually, once to New York and Toronto, and the other time to Montreal. Because in Montreal every year they have a Blue Metropolis Literary Festival, International Literary Festival, that's organized by a writer and publisher called Linda Leith. So Linda was good enough to invite me and Umi to the festival to do some events and promote the novel. And I think it was all paid for by the Ministry of Culture in Taiwan. They've done a really good job at promoting Taiwan literature and culture. So I met a couple of the Chinese speaking writers that Linda knew. The first was Xie Yiwei, who's from mainland China. And Xie Yiwei was looking for a translator and to do the translation. And that was way outside of his budget and outside of Linda Leith's budget. Linda Leith asked to apply for funding from the Canadian government to be able to publish anything, pay the translators. So there's no way that going to pop up so they could get somebody that high profile to do the translation. So I just done Umi, and I didn't even know what the going rate for these things was, and what they were able to offer seemed fair to me. And I read a story by Xie Yiwei, Taxi Driver. It seemed okay, so I committed to doing that. And I did another. I did a novel, Dr. Bethune's Children, for Xie Yiwei, but I was always hoping to do a collection of short stories by Chih-Ying. And we went out for dinner with Linda Leith and Xie Yiwei, Chih-Ying, and Wu Mingyi, I think in Chinatown in Montreal. So I kept in touch with Chih-Ying after that, and he sent me a couple of his short stories, a couple of the stories in the book that turned into Homesickness. The stories he sent me were the story that ended up first, Red Dragonfly, and also Macaque Peach. Those are the two stories that had either won awards or won recognition. So I did those as samples, sent them to Linda, and they got her attention, and she was willing to publish the book, the collection of short stories, which Chih-Ying had published at the age of 27. He was about 35 by the time I finally met him, but he published the stories when he was very young. And the first two stories that I did the sample of, Red Dragonfly and Macaque Peach, really impressed me. And I kept on reading the other stories, and I liked the other stories more than the stories that he had selected to represent the book. So it was really a happy experience translating the stories and working with Linda and working with the author too.
Awesome. Next question. So I mentioned that, speaking of renderings of names, it's important to note that the book's title in English translation isn't, like I said, homesickness, one word, but home space sickness. I'm guessing as translator, that was your decision. Is that right?
Yeah, homesickness was my selection or my suggestion for the title. I made another suggestion, which I'll mention a little bit later. The title in Chinese was Ni Tao Zhe. Is just the morpheme that turns a verb into a noun. Somebody who does something. What's an example?
That's the zhe character, right?
Yeah, the zhe character. What's an example?
Well, we did one on the podcast called I think it was Tun Shi Zhe, so devour,
right?
Devourer,
or zuo zhe is another good example, I think. It's just somebody who does something.
Mm.
So Ni is kind of anonymous. Tao is somebody who is fleeing, someone who is fleeing anonymously, an anonymous fleer, which didn't make sense to me in any of the stories. There's nobody in any of these stories that's fleeing anonymously. So and anonymous fleer was not going to make a good title for a collection of short stories. So when I was translating, I waited for inspiration to come, and as I said, inspiration came twice for the title of the collection. And homesickness came from the title of the last story, which in Chinese is Lü Xiang, traveling in your homeland. So it's sounds like a contradiction in terms. So why would you travel at home? But I guess under COVID, we're all familiar with staycations. So the idea is that you go away for college and you come home and you feel like a traveler in the place that you grew up in, kind of like I felt when I went back to Canada. Maybe you felt the same when you came back from China?
Well, I was going to say, just through lockdown, or the latter end of the UK's lockdown, or at least Scotland's lockdown, I brought my girlfriend back to my home suburb in my hometown of Dundee, and I was quite keen to show her like places that I had grown up, or some of the nearby coastal towns and stuff.
Right.
So I guess that would be a little. We had some sessions of, was it Yuxiang? Traveling.
Yuxiang, yeah.
Traveling at home.
You had the same experience?
I think so. Maybe not for some of the places that I would have been walking by as like a 20-something, but like we popped our nose into a sports center that I used to go to a lot in primary school, which is off the main road. You have to like consciously make a choice to go in there. And yeah, that was that did feel like that was something uncanny. That was exploration in somewhere that should have been familiar, and yet wasn't, just because of time.
Yeah, you think it should be familiar, but it somehow seems strange, and it freaks you out. Yeah. So traveling home sounds like it indicates the journey to go home, right?
Yeah.
But Lü Xiang is traveling at home, or traveling in your homeland. And I wasn't quite sure how to put that in English. And all of the formulations that I tried just didn't seem very good as titles, right? Yeah. Traveling at home, traveling through your homeland. I mean, they're fine as phrases in English, but not as titles of a story. So I thought of homesickness, because when he goes to the city, he feels homesick, and he goes back home, and he feels sick at home. So homesickness as one word is a familiar concept. I wanted to indicate a combination of missing home and then being sick of it when you go home. So the title was supposed to be ambiguous.
Right. Perfect. The next section of our discussion I was going to move on to was deeper questioning about some of the stories. So we've chosen between us 3 stories in the book. One of them is the titular story, Homesickness, so that works quite nicely. Then we're going to do Skutagera. I think is that how that's
Skutagera, yeah.
Skutagera, okay, good. And Quartet, last of all. But let's start with Homesickness. I'll try and summarize this one, and if you feel I've missed anything once I'm done, feel free to fill in any gaps. This one I should do a decent job at, because this one I read more recently than the other 2. So in Homesickness, we have second person narration, interestingly. But I'll just assume that the reader isn't the main character. I'll assume the main character is a youngish man from somewhere rural, I guess, in Taiwan, who's reminiscing about growing up in a property that his grandfather converted to a hotel. So it's kind of about his Bildungsroman, his like formation from kid to adult, but also you could probably just as easily say it's about his granddad, or at least about his memories of his granddad. And an image or a prop or whatever you call it that a lot of the story hangs on is a telephone. The granddad got a telephone installed in the building very, very early on in, well, when the first telephones were becoming available to ordinary people, I guess. And the telephone is still there at the end of the story. And I think, if I remember right, our narrator concludes that he sort of never really knew his granddad. He had a very important relationship with him, but he never felt that he became him or anything. It says here, no one who hears the story would believe that you had nothing in common with him. That's about all you know about him. So it doesn't neatly tie the bow at the end of the story. That would be my summary of it. Do you think there's any key things that we should also clue the listeners in on?
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good summary. It's, as you mentioned, about this guy's relationship with his grandfather, which he didn't know, whom he didn't know very well, and also about, obviously, his relationship to home. He goes to the city, makes a new life, or imagines he can make a new life for himself, but he can't forget where he came from and where he grew up. And even though he doesn't want to stay there, and even though he hates the place, he's haunted by it. And I was going to mention that homesickness, or being sick of home, works in Mandarin almost better than it does in English, because in English we have home and then family, two different words, right? But in Chinese it's the same word, jia jia ren. The connection between the people and the place is even stronger in Mandarin than it already is in English, semantically.
Right. I just remembered I had some text highlighted in this story that I want to read to help me make a slightly pretentious point.
Sure.
And I'm going to link back to a past episode as well to help me. So it was in my episode on Radish by Mo Yan. Have you read that one?
No.
What is it? Toming de Hongluobo, I believe. Transparent Radish is the literal translation. That's a story I loved. It's just a short novella, or a long short story, and we're following this lad. It's not clear how old he is, maybe like 10 or something, maybe a bit younger than that, and he's sort of roped into a work team somewhere in the countryside during like 50s or maybe early 60s China. So building the new People's China sort of era. And he doesn't really fit in because he basically sees more of reality than everyone else. He's super sensitive. And there's amazing descriptions of tiny, minute auditory and visual details in nature he's picking up that everybody who's busy like turning nature into wells and roads and fields isn't picking up. And it rang really true to me of like my own memories of childhood, when like you're in your earliest memories, all the sort of sensory data or your picture of the world is a big mush because you've not really been normalized into existing yet. Your senses haven't been sort of streamlined into what they're supposed to be to function as a human being in society. And that's certainly not what this story is all about, but that was a thread that I latched onto, and I highlighted some text that jumped out at me. So I'll just read all of it.
What you just said reminded me of the beginning of James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man.
Yeah, bingo. Yes, yeah.
Where he's hearing what Catholics and Protestants, and he can't quite make sense of it yet, but it's all somehow frightening.
That's funny. James Joyce has come up, I think, 3 times now in Taiwan season, and never outside of Taiwan season on my podcast.
Okay.
So an invisible presence on the mainland, but inescapable, at least on this podcast when it comes to Taiwan. Anyway, I'm going to keep going. You didn't know what a long time meant when you were young. You just knew long to mean a great distance. So that's a short one. Next one is longer. In fact, this is one big one I've got in 2 parts. The moment you found the key, you remembered the proud family tradition, the ritual of learning to tell the time. Grandpa had taken you on his knee like he had taken your cousins, like he would take your cousins' children. Dial 117, he had instructed. You did as you were told. The time is 4:23. The first time you heard the disembodied voice of time, you thought Grandpa had conjured it up like a spirit medium. You didn't yet understand the ways of the world. You innocently trusted your sisters, your grandfather most of all. But it soon dawned on you that you could dial 117 on your own. You also realized that time proceeded with its unceasing regularity, no matter what your grandfather or any of the adults in your family did, no matter what anyone did. At that moment, the whole world started to change for you. You felt more anticipation than apprehension, but there was apprehension too. But as for what you were apprehensive about, at the time you couldn't rightly say. And then there's a little asterisk here, and then the end of the story, which I'll just read as well because it's so good. Having heard the story, every girlfriend says, "Wow, you and your grandfather were so close. You must have missed him very much." You stay silent. Nobody who hears the story would believe that you had nothing in common with him. That's about all you know about him. The phone still clears its throat from time to time, but that burst of agitation will never again be followed by your grandfather's mumbled recollections, reminding you of the world before you had any sense of time or any knowledge of human affairs. So there you go. That's so up my alley. It's a very strong note to end the story on, in my opinion. Do you have any thoughts?
A nice reading too.
Yeah, and a good translation, of course. So I should ask you first, does any of this grab at you as well? Or are your favorite parts of the story something different?
I'll share my favorite parts of the story in a second, but sure, it grabs me, and especially now that I've had kids myself. I don't know what I am to my daughter. A couple of years ago, I might have been like a god. You know, I'm her hero, or some kind of autocratic ruler that she's starting to rebel against. And it takes a long time when you're going out for you to put your elders in context, your parents and your grandparents. So that was what I took away from this part of the story in particular.
Yeah, I can relate. Like I've said earlier, I'm 28 now, and I'm only just starting to understand what it would be like to have my parents as my friends. I know some people say that they go from being your god to your hero to your oppressor and then to your friend when you realize that they're just a person like you.
Well, that's something nice to aspire to. And yet it's kind of an anticlimactic ending, where he says that he never managed to get close to his grandfather. In that respect, it's kind of a story about failure. But after the asterisk or star here, I thought it was partly an attempt by the author to be humorous. The ending, if you read it as a story of his failure to connect with his grandfather, then it's a story of failure. But it also seemed, at least I thought it was humorous, that he goes on and on and on about it, and then said, "Yeah, I barely knew anything about the guy. I don't miss him. No." Maybe he's in denial. But there are a number of other parts of moments in the story that seem screamingly funny to me.
Yeah, for sure.
He said that Chih-Ying told me that he'd written a comic novel, and that if I translate something else by him, it would be that comic novel. And this story, more than any of the other stories in the collection, was a serious while also being funny. Okay, what did the Pogue say? That if you didn't try to make a joke about it, you might end up crying? Anyway, the first funny bit I thought was when he goes into the store with his grandfather, and his grandfather's going to buy him a toy. So they go into this toy store. Right, he goes into this store with his grandfather to buy a toy. He points up at a robot toy robot, extremely expensive. And the grandfather has, I don't know, maybe bad eyesight. He thinks that he's pointing at the bubble ring right by the toy robot. So and then the grandfather buys him the bubble ring and takes it home and brags to everybody about how understanding you are, what an understanding little boy or little grandson you were, because other kids might ask for the expensive toy. You were satisfied with the bubble ring. So I thought that was fun. And then his Tanga, I always get confused by the familiar relationships, but Tanga is a paternal cousin that's older than you are. Tanga was in his 30s and achieved some success in life with a staff of his own to order around. He had it all: a wife, a son to inherit his name, a car, and a house, and apparently more than one of each. More than one wife and so forth. So So that was funny, I thought.
I think when I'm reading or even watching something that has a bit of tragic drama and comedy, the
It's
drama,
tragic comedy.
yeah,
That's
tragic
it.
comedy, the tragedy tends to drag me in more. So yeah, I think you've unlocked for me a fruitful second reading of these stories if I was to go back to them looking for the humor, because it's definitely there for sure. I was going to ask you as well, what do you think of the use of second person in this story?
I associate second person with Lingshan. What's Spirit Mountain that
Right.
won Guānxì the Nobel Prize, and I maybe it was second person narration, maybe it was just Guānxì. I couldn't make it through Lingshan. I found it really irritating. So, and as a reader, does the second person seem irritating to you in this story?
I think at first I thought this could get annoying, but as I read, it did not. So yeah, as for an author to choose to use it, I think they need to have good reason. I don't really know what the reason was here,
Yeah.
but I think that didn't harm the story too much. I think it still worked. It's a personal form of address, so in that sense, maybe it was a good choice.
Yeah, it wasn't my choice. It was it was Lai Zing's choice, and so I can't speak for him. But as I said, usually second person narration puts me off. But in this case, it seemed to work. I was just trying to put my thoughts together about this. The second person, like third person, is kind of introduces distance from the material. Like if your I narrator, the only distance would be the temporal distance between now, the moment at which you're telling your story, and the past, whenever the story happened. But if you turn yourself in the third person, then that introduces distance, and second person does as well. But then second person is different from third person, because in second person you can have an anonymous narrator. Doesn't matter who this narrator is. They don't even have to have access to knowledge about the story. You can just assume the narrator knows the story, because that's what narrators do. They tell stories. But in second person, you got to wonder who this person is that's talking to him and telling the story in the second person. Is it a family member? Maybe one of his aunts, maternal aunt, somebody with an axe to grind. Is he addressing himself in the second person as a way of getting distance on the trauma? I don't know. The effect to me is to make him seem passive as a character, and that doesn't sound like a good way to approach a story, to make your main character, your protagonist, seem passive. But that's the effect that it has for me, especially in the scene where one of the funniest scenes I thought in the story is when he takes his girlfriend up to the inn to see this haunted room, because in one of the rooms in the inn, this writer came and to spend the night and ended up taking an overdose of amphetamines, and he died in one of the rooms in the inn. And then grandpa sealed the room so nobody could get in, and certainly no guests were staying there. And you wanted to take your girlfriend to see the room. The room was locked, so you went over to the other side and to another building in the inn that had a window where you could look out, and then across the courtyard you could look into the room in which this writer killed himself. And so you're in there with your girlfriend getting hot and heavy, and grandpa walks in with an older lady. One of them had white hair, but the older lady must have been in her 60s. I can't remember. So you're there with your girlfriend, and then grandpa is there with this older woman, and you're looking at each other, and everyone's jaws has dropped, and grandpa sees what's going on. He sees that his grandson is there with his girlfriend, so he goes over, and what does he say? He puts his arm around the grandson's shoulders. I don't know what's happened to the older lady that grandpa's brought home to have sex with, but grandpa quietly walked to your side to counsel you, telling you what to do step by step. Sit down by her side in this case is the girlfriend's side. Hold her hand, touch her hair, put your hand around her shoulder, kiss her cheek, let her feel your breath on her neck. Tell her I'm your grandfather. As if this would help him score a home run with his girlfriend. Then he left the room and closed the door. And then slightly later on, he says that he felt like Grandpa's wind-up doll, like an automaton. How do you pronounce that word?
Automaton.
Yeah, automaton. He said he felt like Grandpa's creature, a wind-up doll, an automaton. Fuck. How do you say that word?
Automaton, I think.
Automaton. Just going through the motions. You did it just like Grandpa had said, and when all was said and done, all you were left with was a sense of desolation. It all happened too fast, and so on and so forth. You didn't get it. All you were certain of was that the man who lay on top of your girlfriend that night wasn't you, it was Grandpa, figuratively speaking. so that scene especially makes him seem passive, as does the use of second person narration. And we've gone through a couple of theories about why the author would have chosen second person narration, but to make him sound passive is my guess.
Yeah, I was just as you were talking, I was thinking, like, what effect does it have on me, the reader? And I think a lot of second person stories I've read, just intuitively, I get the feeling that it's authority figure sort of describing or summing up the character's life. So this hadn't occurred to me until I'd stopped to think about it, but maybe me as a reader, intuitively, I'm imagining something like our main characters at the pearly gates, and whichever angel is there is recounting him the story of his life, often in a kind of kindly, non-judgmental way. Because I don't get a feeling that there's much judgment in the story when the character does something good or something stupid. But that's neither here nor there. That's just that's maybe just how I read things that are in second person, some kind of a parental voice kindly describing to their junior everything that they've done, summing it all up.
Right, that's a consoling interpretation. I like it.
Yeah, consoling is a good word. It's the one I should have used.
As I said, the story did not depress me in the end. And right at the end, the passage that you read, the phone still clears its throat from time to time, but that burst of agitation will never again be followed by your grandfather's murmured recollection, reminding you of the world before you had any sense of time or any knowledge of human affairs. So the end of the story could be about his failure to connect with his grandfather, but it's also pretty clear that he's grown up, right?
Yeah.
He has figured out how the world works and maybe found a place for himself in it. So passive or not, I think it's a positive ending. Yeah,
he got there in the end. Speaking of getting there, let's get to the next story. So it's going to be Skutagera. Now, this one, I must admit, I read this one quite far back in time because I've been busy moving house and starting a new job. So I'll give a really basic summary and maybe you could help me out here. So our main character in Skutagera is a young woman, or youngish woman, I believe this time. And I think, again, she's having some memories of older relatives that have been triggered by an insect that she sees, a Skutagera. Have I got that right, or have I completely muddled that up?
That's the story, yeah. And it's the characters in the story that she calls Grandma and Grandpa. The Skutagera, aka house centipede. It's the house centipede genus. Skutagera is the house centipede genus. In Chinese, that's Youyan.
Youyan, right? Okay.
So this Youyan appears in the story. House centipede appears in the story, and it reminds her of the characters that she calls Grandma and Grandpa.
Right.
So it's about, like homesickness, Skutagera, a transformation tale, is about this young woman's relationship with Grandpa and Grandma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm just trying to remember something. A lot of these stories, if I remember correctly, start with a quote. What do you call that? An epigram? Epigraph. Yes, that's terrible. I work in publishing. I should have known that. I'm just
the kind of mistake I would make.
Yeah.
So the poem at the beginning of Homesickness is I really like it. I hope you don't mind if I
go for it.
Read it. Mist descending and rain on a deserted inn. So there's an inn in the story. Wilting, the flowers on the shore, screeching a francolin, which is a kind of bird like a pheasant. A traveler in a barge at a wharf, no one standing, his heart rending. The tide is out, the water low, the spring is ending. So that's the epigraph for homesickness.
That one is really good.
It's a traditional poem. I think it's a poem, so variable line length, but rhymed. And he seems like a really literary writer, but he's actually a microbiologist by training. And he has described his specialization to me, and it's canola. He does stuff related to canola, interactions between canola and different kinds of bacteria. And he's also done some research on extremophiles, bacteria that live in extreme conditions like high pressure, high acidity, high temperature. So he's never studied centipedes and millipedes, but he goes on and on about centipedes and millipedes, particularly in this story. At the same time, he's obviously extremely well read, like in a literary sense. He's read lots of different writers from all over the world. And the epigraph at the beginning of this story, Scudagera, Transformation Tale, goes, drinking in a cup the tea you poured, drinking with a cup from the tap of your fingertip, the chill of spring. And that's by a modern Chinese poet in Taiwan called Chen Li, I think. I'm not familiar with Chen Li. Anyway, it's a literary quotation at the beginning of the story. So he's like, have you heard of the two solitudes? Is that the expression about people that can combine scientific and humanities knowledge?
I haven't heard that before, but that's great.
I can't remember. It's an English writer, C.P. Snow, was at a party one time, and some professor of humanities was complaining that you scientists, you've never read Hamlet, or you've never read such and such. And C.P. Snow said something, and C.P. Snow was a pretty prominent writer in his day, said something about, well, have you spent time trying to understand the second law of thermodynamics, or something like that? That scientists and scholars in the humanities are often two solitudes. They don't understand what the other's up to. But people like C.P. Snow and Lai Zing somehow able to do both. They're both literate, really widely read, and also scientifically literate, or knowledge about science. So that's the kind of writer that Lai Zing is, and it's most apparent in this story, Scudagera, in which he's quoting Chen Li, modern poetry from Taiwan, quoting all sorts of other stuff, traditional Chinese poetry, and talking about centipedes and millipedes. Shall we read the paragraph in which he introduces the phylogeny of millipedes and centipedes? Diplopoda and Chilopoda are the main orders in the subphylum Myriapoda. This is a sentence from the middle of the story. Myriapods have long bodies composed of repeating segments. So it's like from a science textbook. So yeah. What's it doing in the story?
Who knows? My only take here would be that life and death, or at least mortality, seems to be a big thing in this story.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's a part of biology. We're all living things. All living things
right,
die,
yeah.
Whether we're a Scutagera or a human. And there was a bit I was going to quote here, because I wonder if mortality is on the character's state of mind, thinking of these elderly relatives who, if I remember right,
that's right,
passed away. So I think near the start she hears a loud noise or something.
She's at the beginning. She's trying to get to sleep, and there's a millipede in her bed, and I don't know can millipedes bite? I don't know. She feels this millipede at the small of her back, and then she thinks she remembers spending time at Grandpa's house, and Grandpa used to give her a back rub. So the feeling of the millipede on her back reminds her of Grandpa giving her a back rub, and she has a dream about her grandpa, and then she pees the bed. So she gets up and puts the millipede in a vial, puts it on the windowsill. And the part that you just mentioned, where she gets poked, How did you just put it just now?
She heard a loud noise. I think that's how I phrased it.
Yeah, she heard a loud noise. That's another memory. She's walking to work and walking along the alley, and she hears a loud noise like a ping, like a thunder shower, and then she gets a sharp pain in the neck, and she figures out that somebody has shot her with a steel pellet or a BB gun.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody was using her for target practice.
Yeah, very strange.
So what's this doing in the novel? It's my theory is that it reminds her of the firing squads of the White Terror,
right?
Which might have come out in your podcast before. And in the 50s and even 60s and 70s, even in the 80s, the KMT was executing political prisoners. And the main character of the story, Missy, associates Grandpa with the White Terror. She wonders if Grandpa, this kindly old fellow that has a collection of pet birds and just a nice old man, whether he might have been part of the White Terror. Maybe he was one of the executioners. He's from mainland China. It's a mainlander. So she wonders if her grandfather might have been an executioner, and so she associates people getting executed by firing squad with her own experience walking along the street and getting shot at by somebody with a BB gun.
Yeah, this relates to like a feeling I had living in mainland China, that real scary history was not so far in the past. So I live in Scotland.
Within living memory.
Within living memory, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So like I live in Scotland. That's where it's in this part of the UK that the last land battle was fought on British soil quite safely in the past, in 1745 at Culloden. So no one's got a granddad who remembers that. I guess.
Yeah.
I've known plenty of people who were kids during World War II. I had grandparents who had to go to the countryside. I had a neighbour who was in the RAF. And was over in France for a while for that. But that's a world away from what so many people are just one or two generations away from in the mainland China and Taiwan and lots of the world, really. So like as a translator, do you think that's a challenge where like the Chinese language readers of the story might pick up on these more subtle things about mortality, the threat of death being so much more present, at least in living memory? Is that a difficult, subtle thing to transmit for people in sheltered parts of the world like Brits and Canadians?
If I don't think we had a White Terror in Canada, although the news coming out about the residential schools is pretty frightening. But yeah, if the reader doesn't have enough of a background, make the kind of associations that any Taiwanese reader would make, at least Taiwanese readers that have been educated and are of a certain age, then it's just going to go over the reader's head. So I tried to add a bit of context that would help the reader make sense of it in the introduction. And I can't remember if I did in the story, but that's typically what I would do. Instead of a footnote, I would add a little note in text to explain in really basic terms what the White Terror was. And I think maybe 20 years ago, I would have done that less. I wasn't translating 20 years ago, but I imagine the literary translators are having to explain themselves less and less than they used to because of Wikipedia. Because now, if you mention White Terror and the reader's interested, they can get far more information than you could ever give them in an in-text note or even in a footnote, just by entering in a couple words in Google. So if the reader's curious about it, they can figure out what it's all about on their own. I guess there's only so much you can do for a reader. The thing that you want is a reader that's motivated or interested enough to go and figure things out when things don't quite make sense.
For sure, yeah. I found doing the podcast that can also depend a lot on the sort of the milieu that the publishers and translators are working in. So like Taipei People, that was a product of or published by the Columbia University Press, the translation of Taipei Ren, and you could kind of tell it was translated by academics, maybe not necessarily for academics, but for an academic press. So lots of
very kind of literal.
Yeah, quite literal, and preserving certain key terms. And it wasn't a criticism I had, but I kind of felt, okay, this is all right for me, but the average guy on the street might not know what they're walking into if they picked up this book versus
it's an issue I thought a lot about, and I hope we can talk about it a little bit
for sure
later on. I thought that that Bai Shenyang participated in the translation of Taipei people. Wasn't he the co-translator?
I didn't see that, but I would believe it.
Yeah, and his English is really good. He was in he's been in Santa Barbara for decades, and
course, yeah.
taught university, taught college at UC Santa Barbara for decades. He's now retired, but I'm sure he could translate it in English on his own. Maybe it would be helpful for him to work with a literary translator as a native speaker of English, but maybe partly it's so literal because the author was involved in translating it.
Yeah, that would make sense as well. But then again, he's been in the US so long, you could equally make predictions in the other direction, but who knows?
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read a paragraph here.
Go for it.
It's the sentence that I read before, or the two sentences. Millipedes and centipedes, Diplopoda and Chilopoda are the main orders in subphylum Myriapoda. So like something from a science textbook. Myriapods have long bodies composed of repeating segments and so on and so forth. And so what's this doing in the story? How does it make sense in the story? Well, her ex-boyfriend was a entomology major. I hope I've said that right. And sometimes I get it confused with etymology. It's entomology, isn't it?
I don't know.
Entomology, someone who studies bugs.
Right.
Her ex-boyfriend studied bugs in university. So you can imagine the ex-boyfriend telling her all about bugs, right? So you could rationalize these kind of sentences from science textbook appearing in the story. So why did they appear in the story though? That has to make sense in the story. So I think it's certainly about mortality, as you mentioned, but also about human relationships in the last paragraph on page 161. If only human relationships were as easy to explain as the phylogenetic relations between species. And phylogenetic is qīnyuán guānxì, and the author corrected that. I think I'd said evolutionary relationships. He corrected that to phylogenetic relationships. Phylogenetic relationships is basically just evolutionary relationships, how different species have been produced through the process of evolution. All right, so if only human relationships were as easy to explain as phylogenetic relations between species, with people, it's impossible to predict who you're going to take after or feel close to. Oftentimes, water is thicker than blood. And I thought that water is thicker than blood was brilliant when I came up with it. Do you like it?
No, that is good. Whenever I come across a clever turn of phrase in translated lit, it almost makes me wonder, what was the source language? Was it also a clever turn of phrase?
And I completely rewrote the end of that paragraph with permission from the author. But the funny thing was I said, water is thicker than blood. And I sent that to the author, and he thought that I just made a mistake. I'd meant to write blood is thicker than water, but I'd misremembered it and switched it around. But the point I was trying to make here was that how you feel about other people is not the degree of whatever phylogenetic relatedness you have to them. It's not how closely you're related by blood. Emotional connections to people, like that's how we feel about our girlfriends or our wives. We're not related to them by blood, but we feel extremely strongly about them.
Yeah, I suppose there's a cause and effect that's hard to untangle there, because often we feel strongly about the people we're closely related to, but that's because those are the people we live with.
That's right. That's right. That's the whole point. And the point in this story is that Grandma and Grandpa are not her real Grandma and Grandpa.
Yeah.
She's Taiwanese, and Grandma and Grandpa are from Hunan. They're mainlanders. So they came over with Chiang Kai-shek after he lost the Second World War in 1949 and 1950, and then they ended up living in a Jiantuan, a veterans village, and they were babysitters for the main character when she was growing up. But she ended up feeling closer to them than she does to her own family. She seems a very lonely person in the story. Because now Grandma and Grandpa are gone by the end of the story, and she's living in this apartment by herself. Doesn't seem to have any contact with her family, but can't get over this couple, Grandma and Grandpa, or not her real Grandma and Grandpa, that took care of her when she was young. And I found her recollections of Grandpa in particular very touching. When you translate, sometimes it gets into your guts. The story gets into your guts, and you respond how the writer is hoping you'll respond. And it's not a tearjerker, but there are a couple of moments in here where I always get worked up, like I'd be revising it for the 10th time or whatever, and I would tear up at the right moment in the story. So when that happens, I usually felt that I guess the translation was doing its job.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so it's about people's relationships with people they're not related to, which is a pretty big topic.
Yeah, that came up in another story we looked at, and I'll jump to that in a minute, but I was just going to say I can relate to this a lot because I'm a kid of divorced parents. So I have, there's a fairly large branch of people I would consider my family who I have zero blood relations with, but it has come to mean that lack of genetic relationship has come to mean very little. Although I didn't know them for maybe like the first 10 years of my life, that branch of the family is just as much family, really. It's like I have grandparents in that family, side of the family. I would never really call them step grandparents. I have a sister who's technically a half sister. I would never bother using the half part. It's rendered meaningless by the emotional connections. So that just
she's
rings.
Just a sister.
Yeah, exactly. It rings really true. What was I going to say? Yes, and yeah, there's another story we looked at which looks at and a sort of a stepfather figure, but it's a much darker, more difficult relationship. So I don't want to ask you specifically about that, but I would like to ask you, since I'll confess to readers here, I've not read the whole book. I've just read a selection of stories that I've covered for the episode. So I'd like to ask you, Darryl, is that a theme through the whole book? Sort of family that isn't technically family.
Yeah, that's a good take on it. Sure, that's
right.
One of the themes runs through the book. It's about people's love-hate relationships with home, the people one grew up with, and the people one spends one's time with. I mean, there couldn't be any bigger theme than that, right?
Yeah, that's life in a nutshell, I guess.
It's it's a collection of short stories, and so you wonder what's the common thread. And homesickness is a really, really big theme, right? In James Joyce, in Dubliners, the theme is supposed to be paralysis, right? When I took the novel in university, that's what the professor said. And that seemed to make sense. I think even one of the stories is called Paralysis, or maybe the first story is about an invalid, right?
I've not read it, so I'll just trust you on that one.
Okay, well, paralysis. So as people unable to make changes in their lives, maybe because of the deadlock between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. So it's easier to say what the kind of common thread is in the stories in Dubliners, and maybe also Taipei people. But in homesickness, I'd be hard pressed to say that there's a single theme or single idea that's being explored in different ways in all the different stories. But your theory makes sense. It's about our love-hate relationship with people that related to, and also people that we're not related to.
All right, cool. I'm loving that James Joyce has found his way in yet again. Good for him.
In Taiwan Literary Studies, there's a book about Ireland, and you can imagine that green writers, meaning people that identify as Taiwanese and might identify with Ireland, and I mean Taiwanese writers might identify with Irish writers given the relationship between Ireland and England.
Totally.
As a kind of metaphor for relationship between Taiwan and China.
Yeah, that makes a huge amount of sense. And helps that Ireland is an island. Although I guess the difference is Ireland has that difficult part, Northern Ireland, which is
that's right. That's but in Taiwan, the Taipei is very blue.
Right.
Where Lai Tsing grew up is a pretty usually votes KMT.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I on the last episode on Taipei people with Nadia Ho, I'm glad she didn't find it irritating, but I kept bringing up Scotland for similar reasons because of the parallels. Certainly not a perfect analogy, but it's quite fruitful. If you can accept a little bit of playfulness, it's a fruitful sort of comparison.
There's a book called Hangxiang Ireland in Taiwan, academic book, that's just basically about Taiwanese writers or Taiwanese academics identifying Taiwan with Ireland, or Taiwanese writers with Irish writers.
That's fascinating.
Developing a nationalism in the shadow of a much stronger nation. So I think, if you're playful and you can tolerate differences in your comparison, right? Every kind of comparison involves contrast. But certainly, a lot of Taiwanese people have compared Taiwan to Ireland. I'm sure there are also strong parallels with Scotland too.
Yeah. Do you know if anyone's planning to translate that? Because I would kill to read that book.
Hangxiang Ireland. It's an academic book. I don't think there would be
No.
I don't think there'd be a market.
Oh well. Better learn Chinese then. Speaking of being out of practice, I think I said I would revise what I'd written for this question, but didn't, because I was going to ask you if you wanted to compare this to a story by Huang Fan, the Intelligent Man, which you told me you hadn't read, and I have not revised the question, so apologies. But what I'll try and do is I'll try and summarize them both, and then that should help you see what I mean. So in Quartet, again, I read this one the same time I read Scutagera, so my memory has some of those memories have departed from me. But we have a story told first person by an older woman narrator this time, and she's looking back on a career, well, not just a career, but her life and loves doing working in music, I think in academia, but at least she as a musician, as a Taiwanese person who's gone to America, so I guess a Taiwanese American, and she has romantic and emotional ties with two different men who I think are both Taiwanese who have moved to America, so Taiwanese Americans. And this is where my memory fails me exactly how to differentiate the two men. I think one is sort of the ideal choice, one is the pragmatic choice, sort of a thing.
Yeah,
and there's
that's
some twists and
exactly
turns.
She's studying piano at a big university on the East Coast of these East Coast of the United States. I'm not sure what city she's in or what university it is, but she goes there on a government scholarship to study piano, and these scholarships are such that you have to finish the degree to get the scholarship. If you don't finish the degree, you have to pay it back.
Right.
And so she goes there, and it's a lot of money. In those days, for poor people in Taiwan, just going to the U.S. to take a degree in piano was just tianwen shuzi. It was just a lot of money. So you could only do it if you got this government grant. So she goes there, she's taking piano, and she falls in love with another poor fellow who's also there on a scholarship from British Malaya at the time. He's from Butterworth, I think. It's across the water, across the strait from Penang, from the island of Penang. There's now a bridge, but at the time you had to take a ferry. So he's from Butterworth, and he's a young Chinese fellow who is also studying piano. One day they're practicing, and they don't have their own pianos, right? They're too poor to afford pianos, so they're practicing in the practice room of the university, and they're right next door to one another, and they hear that right next door the person is practicing the same thing, and so they start playing. One hand plays the one part, and then in the next room the other person plays the other part with the other hand. So they play a duet in two separate rooms. They come out and see who it is. I never expected it would be you, and they basically fall in love at second sight. That's their second meeting. So they fall in love, and then later on, the girl from Taiwan gets sick. What does she come down with?
I'm not sure.
Rheumatoid arthritis. She gets sick with rheumatoid arthritis,
right?
And it's so bad, and it's while the young man from Malaya is away at a competition in Japan, and then he goes back home to Malaya. So she gets sick with rheumatoid arthritis, and then there's another Taiwanese fellow there who's taking a doctorate in computer science, and he's he's wealthy, like his parents are rich, and so he offers to marry this girl with rheumatoid arthritis, and she has no choice but to say yes, because she couldn't afford. She's not going to be able to finish her degree, and she could not afford to pay back the scholarship. So she accepts this fellow that she doesn't love's marriage proposal, gets married to him. And so why does he ask her to marry him? Because he's fallen in love with his best friend's wife, and he has to prove to his best friend that he has to give the appearance to his best friend that he has his own woman, and he's not involved with the best friend's wife. He gets married for the wrong reason, obviously.
Yep.
To deflect his friend's attention. The friend suspects that he's having an affair with his wife, which he is, and continues to have an affair with his wife throughout the story. So she marries this wealthy fellow from Taiwan, and not the boy that she actually loves.
So I was going to ask about the intelligent man in this story, and to sum up the intelligent man, it's less subtle and intricate, I would say. It's more sort of cartoonishly, satirically structured. So in the intelligent man, we have another Taiwanese person, a man who goes off to America to, I don't think he's going for academic reasons. I believe he's going for business reasons. But yeah, I think what it is in Taiwan, he has a wife. He goes over to the States, and I think possibly marries again, or ends up with a mistress in the States. His business in the sort of Taiwanese American community starts to dry up. So he goes to the PRC, which is beginning to open up its economy and so on. And he gets involved working with, I think possibly a state-owned enterprise or something there. And he ends up having an affair with a secretary or something from one of the mainland provinces. And just as things are getting more nuts, and everything's falling apart, he goes to Singapore, ends up with another mistress, and it ends with an absurd conclusion where all the mistresses are having like a big joint meeting with him and having him sort of work out who gets what. So the two common threads there being going to America, Taiwanese Americans, and affairs, and I guess also professional life.
Yeah.
So I don't know, do you see anything in the confluence of those themes that is worth analyzing a bit?
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, or you said, the husband of this of the protagonist, the one who gets rheumatoid arthritis, has an affair with the wife of his best friend. But then the best friend dies, and so leaving a young widow behind, and they continue to have an affair throughout the story. So the quartet is the main character has rheumatoid arthritis, the young man from British Malaya, fellow piano student, also poor, husband of the girl with rheumatoid arthritis, and the husband's lover, the widow of his best friend. So that's why the story is called Quartet, and it's just about, I guess, their life courses. Is that a word?
It works, I guess. Life courses, the course of their lives.
Life courses of Chinese people in I don't know if they're expatriates, but overseas Chinese people in the overseas community. So life courses will cross and maybe get I don't know, knitted together or sewn together or whatever the metaphor is. So life courses cross and people's lives get
interwoven,
woven into I guess some sort of textile. And so that's it. The story is, it seems to me, it's not overtly political. Like the story by Huang Fan seems like it's a commentary on business and politics in the Chinese expatriate community or the overseas Chinese community, and then in cultural China, in places like China and Singapore.
There's certainly some ideological things that come up when he goes to the PRC.
It's a commentary on politics and the changing economic and political situation.
Yeah, I think economics works a little better. When he's in the States, he gets into an interesting business. He's producing or importing, I think producing Taiwanese style furniture, or at least Chinese style furniture, for the Taiwanese living in the States, because they have homesickness and
the
Yeah.
American economy isn't producing that for them.
Right.
So yeah, there's some politics and there's some economics in there, definitely.
Right. And sounds from your description of the story, it sounds like he's an opportunist, right? So
Yes, yeah, exactly.
he's from Taiwan, but I mean, there's business opportunities in China. So we'll go to China, we'll go to Singapore. Does he have strong principles, political principles, or is he just basically
Well, I think that's
trying to
why
keep himself afloat as a businessman?
Yeah, I think that's why the title, The Intelligent Man, is
Oh, right.
definitely
He's intelligent, but it's ironic.
It's
clever, but
intelligent with quote marks on it.
no principles.
Yeah.
So when you asked the question about the story, and I was trying to put my thoughts together about the story for the podcast, I thought about other works of literature about the overseas Chinese community in the States, and what came to mind is really political stuff, overtly political stuff, like Zhang Xiguo, who wrote The Chess Master, and Liu Darryl. And both of them wrote novels about Diaoyutai Yundong, Bao Diao Yundong. So the Diaoyutais are this island chain that
yes.
Japan claims, and PRC claims, and Taiwan claims. Everyone claims these islands, and Japan has control over them. So it's a huge nationalist issue. And in 1971, the islands were awarded by some international organization, or perhaps by the states, I can't remember, to Japan. And so Chinese intellectuals were up in arms, and there was this huge movement in the states called Bao Diao Yundong, and there were leftists in Bao Diao Yundong and rightists, conservatives. Former president of Taiwan, what's his name, Ma Ying-jeou, was a conservative or rightist leader in the Bao Diao Yundong, and I think he might even have written his PhD on the sovereignty of the Diaoyutai Islands. So there are a couple of novels about this movement, explicitly political. This story quartet that we're talking about here is not explicitly political. There's a mention of the situation in the Taiwan Strait, the maintaining the status quo, and it's an awkward situation, but you can't talk about it, and you just hope that you don't have to talk about it, that you can maintain the status quo. But that's basically the only political reference in the story. The story mainly seems to be about the personal lives and life courses of these members of the overseas Chinese community. And that's not the reason I like it. The reason I like it is it's ultra romantic. I don't think I've read a story that is more romantic than this one. Did you find that as well? It's this tragically romantic story that because when her actual love, the guy from British Malaya, is back home in Malaya, he gets his eyes put out. He's driving past on his scooter past a Malay village one time, and he runs over a chicken. And so the villagers grab him and beat him up and put out his eyes. So it's just horrible. It's a tragic. That episode at least is tragic. And because of that, he can't get back in touch with the girl that he loves, and she's now married this other guy. He doesn't feel at home anymore, so he goes back to the States and he works as a piano tuner for 20 years, blind piano tuner. And then one day, the girl's husband asked him to go over to their house to tune the piano that he's bought her, and that's the reunion. So the girl is now 50 years old with rheumatoid arthritis and badly disfigured, and the boy is now a piano tuner. Neither of them have been able to have a career in piano. They're both kind of failures, but they get reunited, and they manage to kind of continue their love affair without consummating it physically by making music together. And so it's just ultra romantic is how I would describe it. And I found an example, if you don't mind, at the end of the story. Because he's from British Malaya and he sweats a lot. And that's it's mentioned a couple of times in the story, even though it's not quite so hot in East Coast of the United States. He's always sweating constantly because he's from Malaya. That's the explanation of the main character, the girl. And so she says, if you could, you would collect an entire lake of his sweat and drown yourself in it. She would drown herself in a lake of his sweat. Ultra romantic. At the end of the story, they've been reunited. They're making music together, and she's been planning a kind of love death, a love suicide. What's the expression for that?
Oh, I think lovers
everything,
suicide.
Everything. Your relationship with this person is more important than life. You'd rather die together. What did you say? Sorry?
A lover's suicide? I was just trying to think.
A lover's suicide. She's been planning with lover's suicide. So if she could, she would collect an entire lake of his sweat and drown herself in it. Ultra romantic.
Yeah, and sticky.
And sticky. Yeah.
I think a figure that's come up on the show a lot is the failed scholar. So the person who is a natural sort of literati, but was just never quite good enough, or the stars didn't align and they couldn't pass the imperial examinations and so on. That kind of a character we had on IP People, but just through the podcast, that's one of my favorite sort of stock characters in Chinese lit.
Right.
And I guess in the modern world, it's not so hard, or at least there is a pathway where you can go and do that in academia, maybe not so easy in creative writing. But for people who want to be artists in our capitalist economy, not everyone can do it. There's not enough funding there, or not enough paths to a career.
Only so much attention to go around.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think there's another level to the romance there, even further removed from like the world of affairs, and that's finding joy in music for its own sake without chasing success like the characters were doing early on. And yeah, that speaks to me a lot.
Who am I to say that they're failures?
Exactly. Yeah, failure is a subjective term.
We'll have to figure out what that quotation from the Pogues is. But what does Tom Cruise say in Risky Business?
I wish I knew.
Sometimes you got to say what the fuck. It's but I was trying to think of something that expresses the notion that, I mean, who really cares what other people think of how your life has gone? I mean, nobody cares really.
Yeah, no one's keeping score.
Nobody cares if you're a best-selling writer. Nobody cares if you're published. I mean, the thing that matters is if you think that you're a writer, and if you think you've done what you want to in whatever you've written. I mean, that's all that counts ultimately.
Yeah, the trick is being honest with yourself, I guess.
Have you published any of your own stories, Angus?
Yeah, I've had some stories put out in print and digitally, just a patchwork really. So that the thing is, one, deciding whether I'm happy or not with the patchwork, and two, deciding if I want to find the time to do more, because I'm at an age now where I do have to find the time, not an undergrad anymore.
You got your job. Well, I would like to read the story about the guy going across the bridge and then seeing the SOS phone.
Oh yeah,
has that been published?
Just self-published.
Okay,
but it is out there.
Well, let me know where I can find it.
Okay, I will do that. To avoid crass advertising, I'll do that after we're done recording.
Okay.
Right. So that's quartet. Are you ready to go on to the next set of questions now?
Sure, yeah.
All right, cool. So this is the miscellaneous section, aka the fun section. So first one is the word of the day. The question is always worded, can you suggest a Chinese word of the day? But I guess we can say Taiwanese word of the day as well, if that fits better. So it says also the question is worded for this story. That's not very helpful because we've just talked about 3 stories. So any word of the day that could represent either the book as a whole or maybe one of the stories we've looked at. Have you got any ideas?
Yeah, well, just phylogeny came to mind. Qīnyuán, qīn is qīnxì, like your relatives, right. And yuán is the source, right? With the 3, the 三点水 radical.
Right. Okay.
Origin or source, like where the different species come from.
Okay, I'm going to put this one in the chat to make sure I've got the characters right.
亲源关系, I can send it to you after. That's phylogeny. One of the findings of biology in the past 20 years, correct me if I'm wrong, is that species, the concept of a species is not as stable as it probably seemed to Charles Darwin or to Linnaeus. What is a species anyway? There are different attempts to define it in terms of the ability to breed, but the problem is if you get like two individuals, maybe they might be able to mate successfully, A and B, and then B mates with C, and they can mate successfully, but then A can't mate with C. So A and B are close enough together, they can mate successfully. B and C are close enough together, they can mate successfully, but A and C are no longer close enough. So A and B are part of the same species by that definition. If you can mate successfully, then you must be part of the same species. B and C must be part of the same species by the same definition, but A and C aren't. So the long and short of it is that the concept of species is unstable. And ultimately, it's just the kinds of relationships that are meaningful to us, parental relationships. That's ultimately all that a species is a huge family tree. And that the family tree of a species is just part of the giant tree of life. Because as I said at the beginning, I've been herping a lot and like looking at reptiles and amphibians with my daughter at night, and dragonflies and plants. So this kind of stuff has been on my mind a lot. So when I was translating this novel, and especially Scudagera translation tale, it seemed apropos. Qīnyuán guānxì, phylogenetic relationship. But it's not a really Taiwanese word, is it?
It's quite a scientific word, but no, that's okay.
It's a scientific word.
Yeah, no, that works.
Is there any Taiwanese word that, other than that, the only thing that came to mind was huaijiu, nostalgia.
Okay.
Jiu is the past, and huaidi is in your bosom, when you keep the past in your bosom. Mm-hmm. That's nostalgia, huaijiu. So yeah, I mean, the novel is partly nostalgia, but I guess it's about making meaning of the past being meaningful for who we are today. So it doesn't have to be like you're obsessed with the past or can't let go of the past or anything like that. Understanding yourself partly by where you came from.
Right, that's great, because that ties in quite nicely with the last episode, Type A people. That was the pros, a lot of the pros and cons, or the joys and the errors of nostalgia. That's great. And what you said there about how the category of species is helpful, but also not helpful at capturing the nature of
it's
reality.
Unstable, yeah.
Unstable. Yeah. That's great as well, because I think this is just my own interest I impose on the show, but I love the idea of literature or fiction that tries to get past or raise, or at least call attention to the fact that we have all these categories and words and frameworks that are supposed to capture reality, but really they're capturing our social understanding of reality, and there is a much crazier, infinitely analog, ungraspable network underneath that you can't get to through science.
Yeah, it sounds very Buddhist.
Science, yeah.
It's all convenient means. We have these concepts which are useful, and they have some relationship to the truth, but they aren't the truth.
Yeah.
As for what the truth is, well, all we have is these convenient means, 方便, that are our best approximation of the way things are.
Yeah.
I went through a big Buddhist phase when I was when I was trying to find myself in my late 20s and early 30s. I'm no longer in this Buddhist phase, but I remember it fondly.
Did it bear fruit?
Well, I mean, my best friends now, it's kind of awkward, I guess, for me to tell you who my best friends are at different phases of my life on the podcast. But the people I'm in closest contact now are people that I met in a class I took in Buddhism and Zhuangzi with a professor called Leonard Priestley at University of Toronto. I'm in daily communication with these guys, and we started out in this course in Taoism and Mahayana Buddhism, talking about convenient means, conventional designations all day long, and yeah, so it was a good thing to learn about, and it became a part. It's part of my life somehow. Sure.
Awesome. Well, I didn't see that topic coming, but I'm glad we hit on it, because I'd never thought of those of that that I was thinking of it as Kantian. There's a word I've never used on the show before. His idea of the noumena being the reality that you just don't have direct access to. But yeah,
Sure,
of course,
yeah.
now you mention it, yes, of course, that would make some kind of sense from a Buddhist point of view as well.
I went through another phase being interested in Steven Pinker and linguistics and neuroscience. Is it called neuroscience? Science of the brain and the mind. And so I guess the Kantian take would be that any experience that we have is already informed by categories we're not aware of, like the category of time and space is just imposed on in our experience. And that's all we have, right? We don't have direct perception of anything. I mean, there's this white cup here sitting here. I know it's a white cup. It's easy for me to say white cup. As for what the reality of the thing is, it's filtered through my sensory perceptions and my knowledge, all subconsciously or unconsciously. White cup, the words white cup appear in my mind somehow. And I guess neuroscience is the study of how this happens.
Yeah, and not to not to sound too like I'm smelling my own farts here, but a nice thing I think about learning, whether you're ever going to master the whole thing or not, but having awareness and some knowledge of other languages, especially ones which are total in a very different place on the language family tree, even if they're on the same tree, like English and Chinese, is you realize these concepts, they weren't handed to us by God. Another language might have one-for-one words like what cup and beizi, but other times the differences are overlappings in languages, like you were saying, family, home, and jia, or colors. I find colors, Chinese and English color names really interesting because some stuff overlaps. Other stuff makes you realize, oh wait, these are just sort of habits and conventions.
Yeah, and then you're right. You can't take the way people process reality in your mother tongue for granted anymore.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
It was one of the great experiences of my life, learning Chinese to the point where I realized, whatever justice, whatever cup, anything, that it's not always easy to translate these seamlessly, and people just kind of process reality into different terms in different languages.
Yeah, so in a way, it's a
great thing to learn.
Mm-hmm. It's a perverse sort of gift in a way that there are languages that aren't on the same tree in a way that things, whether they've converged in their evolution or they're parallel, or whether they're totally in a different sort of things are framed differently. We're lucky to have it because it gives us that POV that like English and French, English and German translation just probably wouldn't give you for the most part.
Right. They seem too familiar.
Yeah. Although I suppose German is one of those languages that has lots of words for things that we don't have names for, but that's another kettle of fish. Yeah. Right. Okay. We're getting too serious. We need to get silly again.
Okay, let's get silly again.
Next question is about if homesickness, this book, was a food or a drink, what would it be? And on one hand, this is a very open question. It can be soft, hard, hot, cold drinks. If you're stuck, a food would be fine. On the other hand, I have a couple of stern authoritarian rules. You can't say a really strong coffee. And you can't say a cocktail mix of everything because that's been done to death.
Oh, I thought you said, if you can't think of what to say, you could say it's a cocktail mix. Can I say it's a buffet? That's probably not gonna fly. But
if you can do those, if you can specify what's in the cocktail and what's in the buffet,
okay,
that's fine.
What's in the buffet? Well, what's the restaurant that serves every different kind of cuisine?
Oh, Pan.
It's like it's a chain. I think it's a Swiss chain, actually. They also do really good ice cream. Movenpick.
Right.
If you can go to the Movenpick restaurant, you can have sushi in this part of Movenpick, and then spaghetti is over here, and Indian is over here, and Mexican is over here. It's like whatever you're in the mood for, you can get at Movenpick.
Interesting.
So it's that kind of buffet. And in one of the stories that I thought was very charming, but nothing happens in it. It's a story about this. It's called The Seafaring French Horn. And it's basically a letter that this one young man is writing to another young man. And he's in love with him. I don't think either of us have mentioned that Li Jing is gay.
No, we
And
didn't.
it's, I think he would not be unhappy for me to describe him as a gay writer. Obviously, that's not confining. Just the fact that he's a gay writer and he often writes about homosexual relationships doesn't mean that he's not writing about all the other kinds of relationships, as in stories about granddaughter and grandpa, or grandson and grandpa, or heterosexual lovers. But a lot of the stories are about gay relationships. So in The Seafaring French Horn, it's about a relationship between a young man from Taipei and this Amis indigenous person from East Coast Taiwan. So he goes to visit his friend. His friend takes him home to this small indigenous village. And what do they have? Rat and heart pork chops. And the mother has gathered the rat and hearts herself. And she also serves him wild greens that she's picked herself, bamboo shoots that she's picked herself, and bitter melon salad. She's grown the bitter melon herself. So it's kind of, it's indigenous food, traditional indigenous food in Taiwan. Part of it is grown, but a lot of it is just gathered wild. And in another story, which you mentioned, Silent Cicada, I think he has guānxì meatball soup, or it's called pork ball soup, I think it's called. It's not just meat. I guess even a meatball is meat mixed with other things, right? Spices and maybe some starch. Anyway, so he has this meatball soup. It's quotidian fare in Taiwan. It's not cuisine. I mean, it's not sophisticated cuisine. But then, as a writer, we mentioned earlier that he's very literary. He's very well read. He's quoting Chinese poetry, and he quotes The Ballad of Reading Jail, Oscar Wilde. Right. So I think at the Movenpick, there will also be a fine dining section of the Movenpick where you could order beef cordon bleu and borscht. There's a Russian character in one of the stories too.
Oh yeah.
So it's kind of like it's like an international buffet where you could order ethnic cuisine from all over the world, not just like national cuisine, Italian cuisine, Spanish cuisine, Mexican cuisine. You could also have like indigenous tribal cuisine gathered wild in Taiwan. So that's the kind of book it is if it were a kind of food.
That's perfect. Over and over on Taiwan season, some of those things you talked about have come up. So I've not covered any indigenous literature, but it has always been sort of a presence. I guess Han Chinese or Han Taiwanese writers making an effort to include indigenous elements have been a theme in this Taiwan season. Gay male writer, well, not just gay male writers, but the LGBT writers, because we also had Qiu Miaojin have been really present. And I think this is at least the second time where I picked an author who I just thought was, just in quotes, a male writer, and then I find out halfway through the book or after I finished reading the book that they're a gay man, and I have since learned that that's actually a big feature in Taiwanese literature. I went in totally not knowing that. And then the other thing, which I did go in expecting, but have been continuously surprised by, is like the global perspective. So this is in contrast to mainland Chinese lit, which I've done on the podcast before. Well, that has been what my podcast has basically been about, with some exceptions. And the presence of the non-Han minorities, with one exception, I think, doing Last Quarter of the Moon by Chih-Ying. With that exception, they're
Did you get Bruce on to talk about it?
Yes, he was the guest.
Did you talk to Bruce about it?
Yeah, he was the guest on that one.
I want to listen to it.
It's a good one, yeah. But I was going to say, apart from that, the non-Han minorities have been almost invisible in the stories I've done. LGBT writers and characters, again, borderline invisible. And internationalism has been there in the mainland Chinese lit, but it often has felt sort of stilted, or the characters, even if it's interesting, the characters are just there as an archetype, or they're serving a function to convey an idea. Whereas in the Taiwanese stories I've read, they feel more like people. And even if they are being put there purposely, they're also allowed to be individuals by the author. I feel I've noticed
more
that.
Well-rounded?
More well-rounded, I think so. I mean, I'm perhaps being a bit unfair on the mainland Chinese lit I've read, but the contrast has jumped out at me for sure. I was just wondering if you think those three things are a product of Taiwan being, again in quote marks, like a liberal society. Do you think those things spring from that, or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, I don't have anything profound to say about this. That's a good theory.
yeah. I mean, it seems like almost too easy to make that conclusion.
Yeah,
Uncritically, but it seems quite common sense as well.
I think there's something in it though. Yeah. What is liberalism anyway? You're free to think and say what you feel like, and nobody telling you how you should feel about something, right? Or a certain kind of person, right?
Yeah.
They're cracking down on the LGBT community now in China, right? They're cracking down on podcasts and on student organizations. I think like LGBT clubs at universities or are getting cracked down on. So I mean, if that's the situation, and you're a writer and you're going to be writing about a homosexual character, and I think you'd be worried about the censor, wouldn't you? You wouldn't feel free to speak your mind. You might, on the other hand, be like afraid of homosexuality, of homosexual people, and that might get in the way of getting to know them. And in a liberal society, you're free to say what you're free both to say what you think about a certain kind of person or a certain issue. You're also, I think, have more opportunity to actually get to know people that are different from you. And Taiwan's not just supposed to be liberal; it's also supposed to be multicultural and accepting of different sexual orientations and just all sorts of different kinds of people. So in this kind of society, you're more likely to get more well-rounded descriptions or representations of people in literature. I think that's a great theory, Angus.
Yeah, I think it's a better theory once you go into the specifics like you've done. Yeah, the fact that it's not all just about the simplicity of is it banned or is it not banned, but also what things are you just likely to run into in your life without seeking them out by merit of the fact that they're not forced into the margins. They don't have to hide. You will encounter them, you'll get to know them, and you can talk about them.
That's right.
With other people who are able to talk about them.
Yeah, it's more likely that you can overcome all of the social obstacles that remain in any society of class and background. I just say one thing about Indigenous writers. I'm writing an article now on, or a chapter on Mingyi's Fuyanren, the representation of Indigenous characters. And I've got some anthropologist friends in Taiwan, people who study Taiwan's Indigenous people. And sometimes they seem a little bit hostile to writers like Mingyi who are writing about Indigenous people without being Indigenous people themselves. So it reminds me of debates about who has the right to write about another kind of person in terms of political correctness.
Has that impacted you as a translator? Have you had to think about things like that?
It's just like, it's something you have to think about. Wasn't there not a scandal, but the translation of, didn't Joe Biden ask some young Black poet to read at his inauguration, and then she was going to be translated into Dutch and then into Spanish, and they selected a translator that was not herself Black, and the translator was then taken off the case.
Oh yes, there's a real chance for me to put my foot in it here, so I will give it a summary with no opinions. The Dutch translator the Dutch translator was white and non-binary, so they were not Black. The Spanish guy, I believe he was from Catalonia, but I think he was translating to Spanish, not Catalonian, and I think he was a bit more of a, what can I say, put his foot, like he raised a little bit of a stink about it, I think, whereas the Dutch translator just sort of acquiesced and said, yeah, I understand. I will step aside for a Black translator. And I'm not going to make my opinion known, but yeah, I saw that was all over Twitter.
Yeah. So it relates to what we're talking about here, in that, we're translating writers that are writing about other kinds of people, sometimes marginal social groups that don't have a voice of their own. So Mingyi has been published. He's a very high profile writer. He writes a lot about Indigenous people. Where are the Indigenous people who are able to write about themselves? They haven't appeared yet, except in a couple of collections and I think Columbia University Press is going to come out with a book by Shaman Lampoine, the writer from Orchid Island, but it hasn't happened yet. So obviously a good thing that Ming can raise awareness about Indigenous people in his fiction. It would be an even better thing for Indigenous writers to be able to write their own stuff and find an audience for it. So far, we're kind of stuck with Ming's depiction or representation of Indigenous people. I'm completely okay with him writing about other kinds of people. I think writers should be able to write about whatever they want. I guess with all this talk about political correctness, you do hope that writers are being responsible, or probably writers that we would want to read are going to hold themselves to a higher standard and be responsible in their representations of minority groups or marginal groups, disadvantaged groups, and not just let stereotypes make all the decisions for them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense, Angus?
No, that's more or less. If I would voice an opinion, it's that, yeah, I wouldn't ever want a world where a writer like Wu Mingyi, who's trying to write beyond himself, is subject to like not censorship, but like a censorious sort of atmosphere. I wouldn't want that. But at the same time, I wouldn't want to be reading his story and seeing him completely fumble or misrepresent those characters and then think, oh, come on, man, you're a smart man. You could have tried a bit harder.
You got to be responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I remember when that story about the translator was in the news, Kanan Morse, translator, now based in Taipei, said that in a reductio ad absurdum, pretty soon we're only going to be able to write about ourselves, or we're only going to be able to translate stuff that fits in the narrow identity categories that we've been assigned to. It is absurd.
Yeah,
it's absurd that this black translator or this Dutch translator was taken off the job because they're not black, as if they just simply couldn't understand what it was like to be black. Are we really so unable to understand anyone other than ourselves, or anyone other than our narrow whatever, however we've been pigeonholed socially?
It is a question for sure. Choosing my words carefully here. I would. I think that definitely the reductio ad absurdum is scary. Everyone being in their own bubble. The question is whether that's going to happen, I suppose. But on the other hand, like we were saying with the knock-on effects of having a different status quo, so the knock-on effects of Taiwan being liberal and open has had knock-on effects that go beyond what's censored, what's not. Similarly, if you have someone of a different background translating something, there's not just a box ticking of are they this or that identity. There's a knock-on effect of how will their translation look like. Like doing this podcast, I've never set quotas, but I've always tried to have on men, women, straight people, not straight people, and of course people who are not just a plethora of white translators. That would kind of suck. Frankly, I've never had to make that much of a conscious effort, but if it had gone that way, I would have been worried. I would have done something about it for sure. Because
you got to be representative, sure.
Yeah, if I knew there was one particular category of translator who just wasn't published, I would know I was missing something, even though they're not the authors themselves. Translators' works do look different. I can say that as a reader who's read so much of it. But I think that can be about identity, or it can be like what they're like as a writer. So for example, some of my very favorite translated Chinese books I've read have been translated by Jeremy Tiang, who has all sorts of interesting things going on about his identity. So he's Chinese Singaporean, he's LGBT. But for me, the really standout thing is he's an amazing writer. He's an author as as a translator. And that's what makes him one of my faves, is his books are an absolute pleasure to read. They're
one of my faves too.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I really wouldn't want to see identity ignored, but I would never want to see translators as creative writers themselves ignored. To me, that's really important. I said I wouldn't give an opinion. I failed.
That's okay.
Shall we go on to the next miscellaneous question?
But I mean, if somebody did say that whatever translators are play a different role in the creative process than writers of original novels, I think that's fair. A lot of translators especially seem committed to this idea that you're on an equal footing translator and the original creative writer on an equal footing. Is that what you were getting at just now?
No, I think I was just saying that if I'm reading a translation, I would ideally want it to be just as readable as a untranslated work. And if the translator isn't a good writer, that might not happen unless they got a good editor. I guess they're the unseen heroes, the editors.
I certainly aspire to that myself.
So that's it really. Just I worry that Twitter firestorms about identity can bury the actual readability of books. But that's a worst case scenario. I don't think that's happening. That's a doomsday scenario, not the real situation. Well, I've used the words doomsday, so let's lighten the mood. I'm going to ask you if you've got anything you'd like to promote for the listeners, if they're interested in your translations or your academic work or whatever, where could we point them?
Well, I'll say a few words. I published a book called Indigenous Cultural Translation, a thick description of Saedic ballet. It's an academic monograph about this feature film called Saedic ballet. Have you seen it, Angus?
I have not.
Saedic ballet is from 10 years ago. It's a commercial film. It's indigenous historical epic along the lines of Mel Gibson's movie about Scotland.
Oh, Braveheart.
What was it called? Yeah. It's along the lines of Braveheart. It was compared to Braveheart, but unlike Braveheart, it was filmed in a language spoken by about 5,000 to 10,000 people now in central Taiwan. It's an endangered indigenous minority language in Taiwan. So it was translated from Mandarin. The screenplay, rather, was translated from Mandarin into this minority indigenous language. Parts of the screenplay were originally recorded in the indigenous minority language about 100 years ago by Japanese ethnologists and linguists, 1917 and 1935. And the texts were recorded. There was a myth and a song recorded in the original language in Saedic, and then translated into Japanese after the war. Both versions of the story and the song, the original Saedic version and the Japanese translation, were translated into Mandarin. And in the mid-1990s, the director of this film, Wei De-sung, who also wrote the screenplay, got access to these materials in translation in Mandarin and put them in his screenplay. So partly the translation of the Mandarin language screenplay into Saedic was a back translation into Saedic, but the song and the story ended up very different 100 years later. So comparing the original version from 100 years ago with the back translation tells us a lot about cultural changes in Saedic culture, kind of the change in the way of life. 100 years ago, they were mostly independent. At least 150 years ago, they lived mostly independent lives, making everything that they needed in their daily life out of stuff in the local environment. They did trade to some extent, but most of the stuff they needed they got from the local environment. Today they're just as modern as you and me, with cell phones and screen addictions and everything else. They spend a lot of their time typing stuff in the computers. So 150 years, there've been huge cultural changes in the Saedic community. Comparing translations and back translations will tell us a lot about these translations. So I tell us a lot about these cultural changes. So I've invested a lot of time and emotion into researching indigenous people in Taiwan, especially the Saedic. And now I'm trying to do Saedic ethnobotany, how they're trying to record their traditional knowledge about plants and then translate that into Mandarin and then draw on Mandarin language texts in composing texts in Saedic about plants and other features in the natural environment. So they're translating both ways, from Mandarin into Saedic and then from Saedic into Mandarin. And hopefully in this way, translation is going to be a part of the revitalization of the knowledge, because as I said, only about 5,000 or 10,000 people speak it. Most of these people are over the age of 50. So there's been a failure to pass the language down to the next generation. People are hoping now that through translation, they can pass the language on from grandparent to grandchild. So that's what I'm going to be that's what I'm working on now, and that's what I'm going to be working on for the foreseeable future as an academic.
Right. Okay.
Just like to give a shout out to small publishers. I'm grateful to big trade publishers like Harville Secker, part of Random House, and Text in Australia. I'm very grateful to these publishers for making it possible for Ying's novels to appear in English, but I'm also really grateful to small boutique literary publishers like Linda Leaf and like Balestier. Balestier is a street in Singapore. Mm-hmm. It's a Taiwanese physicist who quit his academic job, quit being a physicist, and decided to start a publisher to publish Taiwanese literature in English. And the name of his publisher is Balestier, because he used to live or work on Balestier Street in Singapore. It's spelled Ballestier. He's been building the list for the past couple of years, and I'm happy to have contributed 2 translations to it. One is called The Tree Fort on Carnation Lane by Horace Ho, Tree Fort on Carnation Lane. And the other one, just gonna have to look up here. The name of the novel as published in English is The Bear Whispers to Me. It wasn't my decision to title it this way. I was gonna call it The Story of a Bear and a Boy. That's by a writer called Zhang Yingtai. Also, Hanford Star. Hanford Star is trying to make pocket-sized books, I guess, on the analogy of, or inspired by Penguin. I think they started off doing Korean classic fiction, and then they got in touch with me after reading The Man with the Compound Eyes to ask me if I would do Lai He, who is the father, he's called the father of Taiwan literature. And so we ended up titling it under Lai He's Taiwanese name, the Taiwanese pronunciation of his name.
Okay, and that's from them. That's fantastic. And there was a question about what book you're reading just now. Is there anything interesting on your bedside table?
Yeah, I read the Taipei Times, and the book reviewer for the Taipei Times is a guy called Bradley Winterton. I never met him. And about 12 years ago, he reviewed a book called Lessons in Essence. Lessons in Essence. And it's a novel about Taiwan. Have you ever been to Taipei?
That's the one part of Taiwan I've been to. Yeah, Taipei.
Okay, well, it's about Yangmingshan, which used to be called Caoshan. It's just the big mountain in the north of Taipei, and it's written by an American expatriate writer. She was in her 30s, young woman in her 30s, teaching English in Taiwan. I assume she was just in Taiwan for whatever reason, and she wrote a novel about life in Taiwan in northern Taipei on Yangmingshan, aka Grass Mountains, Caoshan, except that there are no expatriates in the novel. There are no Americans in the novel. An American writer in Taiwan writes a novel about Taiwanese people. And Lessons in Essence, essence is the essence of beauty. So the main character in the novel is an older man, a teacher of guqin, is it called, the ancient Chinese zither? What's the usual translation of qin? Yeah. He teaches the qin and is a calligrapher and artist. And so beauty, what beauty is a big thing for him. And so he isolates himself from the grubby environment that he lives in Taipei. He goes up to Yangmingshan into this hermit's abode, a hermitage. He goes into this hermitage so he can think about what beauty is isolated from the ugliness of Taipei. And I guess ultimately in the book, he realizes he can't do it, that the ugliness of Taipei is part of the beauty that he's been trying to understand his whole life. So this, I'm getting all worked up here. This is my favorite novel. Anyway, what I'm reading now is a novel that the book reviewer who brought this Lessons in Essence novel to my attention, Bradley Winterton, had written and published subsequently. I think he published his novel in 2017, just a couple of years ago. And the novel is called The Mystery Religions of Gladovia, GLAD, so Gladovia. And Gladovia is supposed to be this kingdom in South America somewhere. And but it's in an author's interview, Bradley Winterton said that it was actually about Taiwan. But it's a novel about gay S&M.
Oh my goodness.
It's a philosophical novel about beauty, but it also involves a lot of gay S&M. And Bradley Winterton said that he didn't want to say that it was actually set in Taiwan because all of the people in the international gay S&M community would have flocked to Taiwan and turned up in Taipei, expecting there to be a lively gay S&M scene. And it's really good. The Mystery Religions of Gladovia. I enjoyed it a lot. It's beautifully written, and it's thoughtful. Has a very, very happy ending, and the gay and S&M chapters were highlights of the novel. Okay. Really well done.
Listeners, take note.
It's unscripted. It's a conversation. It's like directed by questions, but when I'm giving a lecture at university, kind of planning out beforehand, and you try not to and ah, and you try to make sure that each idea flows onto the next in a way that the students are able to understand. So it's a lot more edited than this has been. I hope I didn't go on and on too much.
No, it's okay. I think that's the kind of podcast I try to make, because that's the kind I like to listen to, ones with good tangents. So no sweat there.
It's been great talking to you, Angus.
Yeah, been great talking to you too.
Right, we've reached the end of the show. Now, I'm not going to linger on the end plugs too long, because like I said, it's very warm here. My throat's rather dry, but here we go anyway. So first plug, if you are a fan of the show and you want to give something back and you want to get something extra in return, then the Patreon is the best way to do it, the True Terrific Patreon. There are something like 60 odd bonus episodes up there. I've still, for like the next month or two, got one new one per week queued up there. If you want to hear sort of me reacting and rambling solo, sometimes rambling, sometimes it's more formulated, but talking solo just about the things I've read, things I covered on the show, and other things that I haven't covered on the show, for example, non-fiction books, occasionally movies and stuff. The Patreon has got hours and hours and hours of stuff for you there. $1 a month is all you need to get access. You can, of course, contribute more. You would be a saint if you did so. So yeah, that's the Patreon. There's also other ways to support the show, but that's the one I wanted to plug. Social media. So of course, I'm sure you know by now, the places where you can connect with this podcast on social media are its Instagram account at Trutrufic, TRCHFIC. I've got my own Twitter account, which is mostly just exists for the purpose of this show. That's at Angus Likes Words. We have a show Discord. It's generally quiet, but you're always welcome to share thoughts. There you can talk to other listeners or myself on the Discord. There'll be an invite link in the show notes. And of course, you probably know what I'm going to say if I'm a long-time listener. Social media and giving me money are, of course, wonderful things, but neither of them are the best thing you can do for the show. The best thing you can do for the show is spread the word. So if you have a friend, if you have a colleague, if you have an intellectual equal who you want to bestow this gift upon, tell them about the show. And of course, if you have a grandfather who's busy initiating you into the ways of the world, tell him. And if you happen to meet a bug that reminds you of that grandfather, tell the bug too, because I think that's a listener base we really need to expand into, is the insect world, because of course their numbers are fantastic. They outnumber us humans, what is it, millions of times or thousands of times? So I'd love to tap into the insectoid audience. That seems like a winner really, especially if I can kind of tunnel them onto the Patreon and can get those bug bucks rolling in. But until I do that, I'll just say 再见.